Today's nouveau riche will be tomorrow's aristocracy, just as today's aristocracy was yesterday's nouveau riche.
Now, where's that from, Alex?
This is La Región Más Transparente. It's Carlos Fuentes' first novel, written in 1956, and yet it is perfectly resonant today. It describes Mexico City as this enormous city full of a melting pot of classes and peoples, which, when I read it, felt pretty relatable to today. Yet what's funny is, when I talked about it with a northern Mexican friend, he said it was completely different from the society he grew up in, a slightly less unequal society, where all these stereotypes of 1950s Mexico City simply didn't speak to him in the way it did to me. And yet, there is one archetype, one sort of person who is universal to Mexico and pretty much infamous. And it's the sort of person we're going to be talking about today.
Now, these people are generally called fresas. Fresa in Spanish actually means strawberry, but when we talk about strawberries, we're talking about a group of people who, as a group, are referred to as fresas. Now, officially, according to the Mexican Dictionary of Spanish, the term refers to people who come from a very privileged social class. Privilege understood specifically as financial privilege. Now, that sounds a lot like poshness as referred to in the UK. And it is in many ways, but it must be noted that the hoops that one must jump through are particularly Mexican in flavor. Now, just a quick distinction. Because being fresa means belonging to a specific privileged social class, there has been since the 90s and early 2000s the notion of fresa as a subculture. That is, people who want to look like they are fresa so that they look like they are rich and belong to this privileged social class. But we won't be focusing on that today, but rather fresa as a group of people.
Or perhaps we will be touching upon how that idea of fresaness as an indistinct category that is difficult to discern, it's kind of the worst case scenario for the fresa class today, because as I mentioned at the beginning, the future aristocracy is always made up by the nouveau riche, and the hoops that you have to jump through, the limits and cultural mores that define what being a real fresa is, are very much the boundaries created by this social class to keep the new money out. There's nothing more vulgar and common than new money to a fresa, and that's what we're going to be talking about. So let's dive in.
So today's a particularly special day for us because we usually record on opposite sides of the world. Today, we find ourselves together in central Switzerland.
So if this sounds particularly good, it's because of that. And if it sounds terrible, it's also maybe because of that. But it's lovely to be here in the flesh with Tavo, sort of living and breathing a little bit of the fresa way of life. Because don't you find that Switzerland is sort of like the Mecca for the Mexican fresa? It's sort of far away from the horrors of Mexico as they imagined them, and it's in the high-class globetrotting center of the world where they'd rather be.
Definitely. I think one of the things that's at the heart of being fresa, it's belonging to a sort of transnational wealthy elite. And if Switzerland is not the home of a transnational wealthy elite, I don't know what it is.
So what's interesting to me is, to begin with, how do you actually become a fresa? A fresa being this Mexican upper-class, toff.
Well, you can't really. I mean, sort of. Now, the thing about fresa is that it's a category, and as categories, it is inherently prone to morphing and to being slippery. But there are a few things that we can identify that make you a fresa or that are fundamental to becoming fresa.
So one of the key things is money, of course, right? You said financial privilege. Really, it's it's a much broader category, but money is essential. It's not sufficient, but you need money to be fresa. In fact, I think one of my favorite sort of depictions of fresa culture is this film called Niñas Bien, which is about the 1982 financial collapse in Mexico, where this very upper-class woman is forced to come to terms with the fact that her family's lost her money, but she simply can't lose face. And it's made all the worse by the fact that her new group of friends has this woman who's very, very naff because of the fact that she's new money. But she is by far the richest person in that friend group. The new money imbuing this social class with the basic necessity, which is cash, but there's so much more. There are so many more limits that stop people from becoming fresa on the first try, we'll say, or in the first generation.
Heritage is enormously important. When you meet people of the Fresa group, and this is particularly happens to be the case in places like Mexico City, people will use, I don't know, you'll introduce yourself and say, my name is whatever, and say your last name, and you will often be asked, oh, are you of this particular family? Because in that case, I went to school with your uncle, or my father went to school with your grandfather. And that is a constant thing that happens in the Fresa group and highlights just how important that heritage is.
Just as a quick question, you know about this more than I do. What's the actual origin of the term?
So it's really interesting. It all goes back to the Olympics that happened in Mexico in 1968. In 1968, the architect that was in charge of much of the infrastructure that was built for the Olympics also designed a uniform that was pink and white. Now, in Mexico, a common dessert is fresas con crema, strawberries and cream, right? So strawberries and cream looks very pink and white. And for the Olympics, you required a lot of staff, people showing you around, taking you from point A to point B. And a lot of the people who did this job did it as a side hustle, just to be part of the Olympics. Everyone wanted an excuse to be there. And a bunch of people who did this job as a summer job, really, came from, at the time, the most expensive private university in Mexico, which was the Ibero, La Universidad Iberoamericana of Mexico City, which is a Jesuit school. And it is a school that has always concentrated a very significant chunk of the rich and mighty of Mexico City. So you had these people who were rich and mighty, who looked different, who spoke different, and they were dressed in pink and white. They looked like strawberries. And so they were baptized as the strawberries.
Fresas. I love that. I never knew that. But what's wonderful is from that, you get this incredible culture, which has its old heritage, right? That's an old tradition to be an aloof toff in Mexico, as in many other parts of the world. But they've got their own distinct Mexican flavor. I'm particularly interested in the relatively recent sort of hatred of the state. There's two reasons for that, I believe. The first is to be a sort of like aristocratic, Republican aristocrat, you need to be aligned with the more conservative parts of society. All these movers and shakers trying to redistribute wealth and all that are pretty unacceptable to you if you're part of this class. And so that explains why many of the schools that they attend to are not only private, they're religious. That's a pretty crucial element of these schools. But also, no matter how good the school is, it's crucial that it is private. Specifically, this was made worse in the 1980s when there was a financial crisis, the one I've just mentioned in this film, Niñas Bien, which destroyed the fortunes of so many people and made the fortunes of so many other. So you did get this slow recycling of the fresa class. But to keep it pristine, so to speak, you kept it away from the tarnishing influence of the state. So there's this broad rejection, I feel, and we can debate whether or not you feel this is true, because I think this is a generalization, but I found that there's a rejection of public education at any level and of any standard. Mexico has some pretty good public universities, and yet I've come across some fresa workplaces that deliberately will not consider anyone from a public university.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And of course, there's always the weird kid who decided to go to public school, but it's kind of like a flex when you belong to this ultra rich group to say, well, I can study wherever I want because my status is not going to be questioned. But for the most part, particularly for people who have become in some way part of the Fresa society, who aspire to be part of Fresa society, you definitely will not go to a public university. And public universities is up for discussion a little bit, but public school in general, primary school, middle school, and high school, is a definite no. And that really sets Fresa people aside from the rest of the country.
And this is where we come to the necessarily even darker parts of Fresa culture, because there is a deeply ingrained racism within this classism. Now, as we've discussed often, racism and inequality come hand in hand, and racism in Mexico is relatively different from its sort of evil cousins in the United States and Europe. And yet, I would argue that being part of the cosmopolitan elite has, to some extent, Americanized a lot of the racial discourse within Fresa culture. The fact that the term whitezican was adopted and imported by these folks, which is very much a US term, I think really underscores this. But then you see a lot of the racial elements across the institutions that Fresas belong to pretty quickly. What I think is pretty horrifying is the fact that it got so bad at one point, entries into these private schools being dictated by quote unquote what you looked like and what families you belonged to, that the Supreme Court from 2009 and in various other moments ruled that even if all the parties had agreed explicitly or tacitly, that's the parents, the schools, everyone involved, even all the parties had agreed that one could only be a member of an institution because they looked a certain way, quote unquote, even that was unconstitutional. That was violating people's rights by simply existing as an agreement. And so again, right, this is the big state encroaching on Fresa culture. So you can see a lot more tension between the state and this group of people. It's a never-ending story. And I'm sure there's other ways to racialize discourse without having to be as obvious as having a racial category to get into those schools. But that is a pretty clear status symbol within the Fresa community. So you've got to be rich, you've got to be part of a heritage, and you've got to be pretty white performing.
I think it's quite interesting there is we've said that being Fresa means that you belong to a privileged class. Now, originally, the category Fresa did not really exist until, as we've said, the 1960s, and only really became super relevant in the 1990s and onward. But with time, the concept of being Fresa has become so important, particularly in places like Mexico City, that people now associate often, and rightly so, that if you join this particular group in some way, if you can at least simulate being a part of this group, then that can change things for you going forward. So while it might not necessarily have started as a purely racial thing, that in these schools there would be primarily, if not exclusively, white people, it was that way more because of migration in history and what particular Catholic order you belong to and so on, and that happened to have a racial distinction to it. With time, it has become very racialized because people from another background want to join the club, and then the color of your skin suddenly becomes a lot more relevant.
And what's sort of fascinating to me is the fact that you need to have these cascade of conditions because one alone doesn't protect the group as much as you think. I think language is a fascinating one because a clear and necessary distinction for being Fresa in Mexico is to be able to speak English. Spanglish is a pretty classic thing among the Fresa culture. But then again, another group of people tends to be able to speak English as well, and that's the Mexican-American community. And so to distinguish themselves from these folks, people would tend to align more, not so much with English speaking as itself, but a specific sort of English speaker, which is the WASPish. This is the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant group within the United States. And Fresa groups became really adept at incorporating themselves into the activities beloved by these groups. And so you've got places like Vail, which are pretty much catering exclusively to Mexicans at this point. There was an interesting story in which when Donald Trump's first term came around and he was particularly offensive to Mexicans, a lot of these folks stopped going as a protest. It really hit what you would expect to be the poshest and whitest parts of American society. And many Americans wouldn't have expected those places specifically to be hit by a Mexican boycott. However, because of this mixing with the preppier parts of the United States, you get a development of a specific sort of accent. It's a Mexicanish accent spoken in English, but crucially, it's also, and I don't know if this is untrue, but I'm going to repeat it because I love this story and it feels right, the Spanish spoken by Fresa communities is also heavily anglicized in its own accent. And so one of the notable things about Mexican Fresa Spanish is that it has a sort of Valley Girl twang to it. We'll probably splice in a clip with a couple of people talking Mexican Fresa Spanish. It's very distinctive, and if you pay attention, there is a Valley Girl twang deep in there.
Oye, Neto, necesito que me acompañes a Nueva York para comprar mi vestido para la boda de Mariale, güey.
Yeah, and what's super interesting is that this accent, which did not necessarily exist in the entire upper class of Mexico City at one point, now does exist in the entire upper class of Mexico City, even though the upper class is spread out over quite a large area. So if you go to the south of Mexico City, and then you go to the northwest of Mexico City, and you go to the richest schools there, the accent is almost identical and very different to everyone around them.
So what we've got now is the recipe to get in, or rather the hoops you have to jump through to get into the Fresa class. That is heritage, it's money, it's language, and it's education. It's sort of like the belonging to these institutions. So what do you get once you're in? And the answer is access to the very institutions that we just mentioned. So it's a pretty circular system. That's what makes it so difficult to penetrate. And that's what allows it to be so exclusive within Mexico, regardless of how much people may put on the accent, may carry out the tropes of fresaness. It is very clear who is fresa and who isn't fresa, regardless of the performance. So when it comes to education, it's access to schools like El Irlandés, El Regina, but it also means access to social groups. The most interesting of them, to me, being an online Facebook group called Lady Multitask, which is a group divided across Mexico in regions, but very much tied amongst the fresa communities in the country. And you can only get in if you are recommended by a previous and existing member. It's a social club where you get access to all these goodies, to all these social events, to all this networking, to lots of different sort of products that you can buy and trade on Facebook, but only if you are basically fresa.
And it's not only these things, right? It affects pretty much everything. If you want to buy an apartment in a particularly luxurious, closed community in Mexico, you need to be approved. Now, if this goes up to the courts, it's not allowed, but it rarely does make it up the courts. So if you want to belong to a certain sports club, you better fit the description that they're implicitly looking for. You want to buy a house, same thing, particularly if you want it in the nice neighborhood. And the neighborhood that you come from, or the school, particularly primary through high school that you went to, can really define who you are or who you can be in Mexico. Something that I hadn't really realized having grown up in Mexico, but you see it when you're abroad, is when people ask you in Mexico which school you went to, they're not generally asking about your university. They're asking about which high school you went to.
Mm.
And that doesn't really happen. Like, imagine in the US or in the UK, sure, in the UK you have these schools like Eton College, but for the most part, when they're asking you about what school you went to, you talk about your university. If you went to Ho-Ho-Kus Public High School in New Jersey, nobody cares. But in Mexico, people care.
And this is ultimately because there are private schools in Mexico where you make your friends and then you go off to do a variety of things and you'll spread out not only across Mexico, but across the world. And that's another, I think maybe one of the defining features of being fresa from Mexico, which is you become a globetrotter. One of the most famous instances of this, I find. I think he's the epitome of fresa, to the extent that he's barely even Mexican at all, but he's almost the aspiration of this aristocratic class within Mexico. And it's the Mexican ski Olympian, or rather, the man who represents Mexico in the Winter Olympics for ski. And it's Hubertus von Hohenlohe, who is basically an aristocrat. He's rarely stepped foot in Mexico. He's distantly related to the country, but he is the epitome of what I think a fresa really deep down wants to be, which is not Mexican. What do you think of that? Is that too controversial?
I think you're right, but I think it's maybe not belonging to all of Mexico. So something that happens a ton is fresa people will definitely listen to Mexican music, but it's a particular brand of Mexican music. So for people who know it, there's groups like Timbiriche. Timbiriche is very, very Mexican, but it's not at all traditional Mexican. So yes, fresa people will listen to that. But mariachi, northern banda, this kind of music, which the bulk of the country listens to, that is often less so in their repertoire.
That's true. And there is also the fact that being fresa in Mexico may feel different from being fresa and Mexican in Switzerland, where you are definitely put down your place by the social mores here, and also just by the sheer cost of everything. In Mexico, you have access to this enormous pool of unequal labor, which I think is a crucial part of being fresa in Mexico. And it's also where most of the markets these folks work in exist. So dad's factory will be in Mexico, the company will be in Mexico, and so they're sort of forced to be where they've made their money. And that really shows. As I said, the public sector and the private sector are very much at odds when it comes to Fresas in Mexico, and you can really see it in the stats. When it comes to politics, which most Fresas wouldn't ever dare to go into because it's just beneath them, I think, or they think it's beneath them. In politics, Mexican women specifically now control over 50% of political elected office.
Is this at all levels?
This is at all levels. This is from the local to the federal levels, state level. It's over 50%. It's 56% at the federal level.
Which is extraordinary in a global context.
Yeah, no, it's very progressive and it's great. I think Mexico is a pretty progressive place when you talk about people as a whole. And yet when you talk about the small percentage of people who we've categorized as fresas, it suddenly gets very conservative. Why is that? Well, we've discussed it. It's sort of this animosity to the redistributive state that Mexico's created over the past 100 years. It's trying to retain their aristocratic roots in a republican system. And so it's made them very conservative people. They intermarry quite a lot. There's this sort of old-fashioned racism. And crucially, it makes it very difficult for women to enter the business space. One of the most horrifying stats to me is in politics, you've got over 50% female representation. In business, the C-suite, which is the top executives in business, that number is 13%. Only 13% of executives in Mexican business are women, which is far below even other comparable nations across the world. And so you can see the enormous effect this small group of very influential people can have over Mexico as a whole, even when they're trying to exclude themselves from Mexico overall.
I think that's something that's really interesting with the stat about women in business is the importance of conservatism and of doing things the way, quote unquote, the way we do them, right? Because if you go to the best universities in Mexico, there will be women in the toughest programs and they will do exceptionally well. And they will then go to the big investment banks, the big consulting firms, and the big legal firms. And then somewhere around the time they're thinking of having kids, the bulk of them all leave. And it's obviously not a matter of them not being able to stay. Often they are the best. But it's expected of them to leave because that is what that particular part of society does.
Or when you've got a succession within a company, what you'll tend to get is the women get the sort of charitable arm of the company, while the men are handed the reins of the business proper. So again, right, it's just constant conservatism born of this pretty old-fashioned way of seeing the world. But Mexico's a changing place, and one of the interesting things that we've covered quite a bit in the Mexico Political Economist is the fact that politics is coming into business in an important way, and you can no longer avoid the state, regardless of who you are. And I think that's an interesting, fabulous, and mildly terrifying thought, because bringing us back to the beginning of this episode when I quoted Carlos Fuentes saying that the aristocracy of the future is the new rich of the present, we're more or less starting to see that change. First in politics, this new political party sweeping in and taking virtually complete control after these landslide elections, but then also the state coming into business to force things to shake up, for better or for worse, but it'll definitely shake up the social structure of these folks as well. We're already starting to see it in very obvious ways from the previous old guard, don't you think?
Definitely. People who were relevant, even important technocrats in the 90s and the 2000s, who belong in many cases to this particular social class, well, with the change of the guard that has been Morena at a national level, these people become far less relevant. But they're the ones with oftentimes the best education. They're definitely the ones most of the time with a lot of the money, and they have kids. Where are these kids going to go? What are they going to do? And how are they going to become part of the system, if not for any other reason, to protect their capital?
Well, we'll just have to wait and see, and we'll be around to watch it. So we'll see you next time. Again, separated by an ocean, but no less excited to see the future of what happens in Mexican politics. So, till next time, I'm Alex Gonzalez-Omrod.
And I'm Tavo Figueroa.
And this is Mexico, the podcast.
Every 2 weeks, we'll be talking about Mexico, its history, its economy, politics,
and why you, wherever you are in the world, be it Davos or Mexico City, are deeply affected by it every single day. Subscribe to the Mexico Political Economist to get more of these episodes and much, much more.
Oye, Neto, necesito que me acompañes a Nueva York para comprar mi vestido para la boda de Mariale, güey. Es súper importante para mí. O sea, es mi best friend desde que estábamos en el cunero, güey.